I remember the brutal heat of the Nubian desert, the kind that makes the air shimmer, where endless gold-colored dunes finally give way to the life-giving Nile. That's where a story began. One so powerful it would rattle the Roman Empire to its core. And no, this isn't another tale about Caesar or Cleopatra. Those names everyone already knows from history books. What I'm talking about is the rise of a warrior queen whose sheer defiance burned so hot that even Augustus, the most powerful man alive at the time, found himself forced to sit down at the negotiating table. Her name was Amanirenas, and she pulled off something no other African ruler had ever dared to try. She stared the Roman Empire right in the face, and chose to fight. Let me paint the picture. It's 30 BCE. Rome has just swallowed up Egypt, and Augustus Caesar stands on top of the world. His armies have steamrolled every opponent from Gaul down to Germania. The Mediterranean? At that point, it may as well have been a Roman backyard pool. But farther south, past the violent waterfalls and rocky cataracts of the Nile, there was a kingdom Rome barely understood. A place where women stood shoulder to shoulder with men, where gold was so common it felt almost ordinary, and where warriors had been sharpening their craft for over 1,000 years. The Romans called that land Nubia, but the people living there knew it by another name, the Kingdom of Kush. And despite what Rome liked to think, Kush wasn't some rough, backward borderland waiting for civilization to reach it. This was a nation that had once conquered Egypt itself, a culture that built more pyramids than the Egyptians ever managed to dream up. At the center of it all sat a queen who would prove, very clearly, that African steel could bite just as hard as Roman iron. But before I get to how she challenged the greatest empire the world had ever seen, we have to go back to the very roots of her power. The Kingdom of Kush stretched down the Nile like a bejeweled serpent, winding from the first cataract of Upper Egypt all the way south to where the Blue and White Niles meet. For more than 3,000 years, this land had been shaped by battle-hardened kings and queens who ruled from grand capitals that could rival anything Rome had built. Their wealth was the stuff of legends. Gold streamed out of desert mines in amounts so staggering that ancient Egyptian pharaohs once called Kush the source of all their riches. And it didn't stop with gold. Kush had iron, too, tougher and rarer than bronze, and their smiths forged weapons so impressive armies from Libya to Arabia envied them. But honestly, the most valuable resource Kush ever had was its people. Their skill with the bow was unmatched anywhere in the ancient world. Their reputation was so famous that the name of their whole land came to represent it. To Egyptians, to Greeks, to anyone unfortunate enough to stand opposite them in battle, Kush was simply the land of the bow. Kushite archers could shoot the eye out of a man from 100 paces. They could fire off 20 arrows in the time a Roman soldier needed just to pull his sword free. Their composite bows, made from horn and sinew, could punch through armor that usually turned aside a thrust from a Roman gladius. When Kushite warriors took the field, their arrows filled the sky so thick it looked like a swarm of locusts rolling in. But here's what really set Kush apart from the rest of the ancient world. In this kingdom, women didn't just whisper influence from behind palace doors. They stepped into power with both hands and wielded it like a weapon. They bore the title Kandake, meaning great woman, and they ruled not as sidekicks or placeholders, but as absolute monarchs in their own right. Kushite Kandakes commanded armies, forged treaties, and raised monuments that told the world exactly who they were. They wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Kush, holding the titles of both king and queen. And when they rode into battle, enemy armies felt the earth shift under their feet. Some ancient writers were so stunned by this level of female authority that they assumed Kush must be ruled entirely by queens. And honestly, given how dominant these warrior women were, it's not hard to understand why. Into this world of wealth, strength, and unshakable ambition, Amanirenas was born around 60 BCE. We don't know much about her early years. Time has swallowed up many of the details, but we do know she rose to power during one of the most chaotic moments the Mediterranean had ever seen. As she grew from a young princess into a ruling queen, the world around her was twisting itself into knots. In Egypt, Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, fought tooth and nail to keep her kingdom from slipping into Roman hands. Back in Rome, Julius Caesar had already crossed the Rubicon, and the whole republic was tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war. By the time Amanirenas, whom I'll call Amanirenas the way her name often appears, claimed the title of Kandake around 40 BCE, she stepped into power over a kingdom that had held on to its independence for centuries. Egypt might have fallen under Rome's thumb as a client state, but Kush was still standing on its own feet, its borders firm and its people unbroken. When she took the throne, she didn't just inherit a crown. She stepped into a long tradition of defiance. Her ancestors had stared down Egyptian pharaohs, fought off Persian governors, and outlasted the Ptolemaic armies. Now it was her turn to face a challenge far greater than any of those, Rome at the height of its power. The land she ruled was something extraordinary. The capital, Meroë, sat sparkling along the Nile, alive with merchants traveling from all corners of Africa and beyond. In the desert nearby, steep pyramids, Kushite in style, not Egyptian copies, rose sharply from the sand, catching the morning light and stretching their shadows across the royal burial grounds. Inside those city walls, artisans shaped gold and iron with a mastery that could stand toe-to-toe with anything being forged in Rome or Alexandria. The royal palace sprawled across prime land along the river, its courtyards filled with gardens where bright, exotic flowers bloomed even in the heat. Bathhouses piped cool water in through underground channels, offering relief from the blistering desert sun. And in the grand audience hall, beneath ceilings painted with the victories of her ancestors, Amanirenas held court like a ruler who knew exactly who she was. But her real strength wasn't in the palaces or the gardens. It was in the military machine she commanded. The Kushite army had been sharpened and perfected over centuries. At its core were the famous archers, men strong enough to pull bows so heavy that most soldiers couldn't even string one. Behind them stood infantry carrying iron-tipped spears, bronze axes, and shields tough enough to stop the sharpest steel. Their cavalry wasn't large, but those riders moved across the desert like ghosts, appearing out of nowhere to hit enemy flanks before slipping back into the dunes. What tied all of this together was the authority of the Kandake. When Amanirenas gave a command, no one hesitated. She had earned her people's loyalty the hard way, through leadership, discipline, and victories carved into the memory of the kingdom. Still, even as she strengthened her rule at home, trouble was building to the north. In 31 BCE, at the naval battle of Actium, Octavian, who would soon call himself Augustus, destroyed the combined fleets of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. That crushing defeat marked the end of any hope Egypt had of remaining free. The very next year, Antony and Cleopatra chose death instead of humiliation, and for the first time in 300 years, Egypt passed directly into Roman hands. Augustus wasted no time reshaping his new prize. Roman soldiers marched through ancient cities like Memphis and Thebes, their boots clacking over stones that had seen dynasties rise and collapse. Tax collectors spread across the Nile Delta, demanding gold, grain, and obedience. Roman officials began mapping and planning, their sights drifting further south, straight toward the wealthy kingdom beyond the cataracts. From her palace in Meroë, Amanirenas could see exactly what was happening. Rome had swallowed every land it touched. Gaul had been crushed under Caesar. Britain was trembling at the edge of Roman reach. The Germanic tribes had been broken in the forests of Teutoburg. Even the Parthians, Rome's most stubborn rivals, had been forced into uneasy diplomacy. Amanirenas understood Rome's hunger. Every border was just another temporary line. Every peace treaty was simply a breather before the next invasion. And now Roman engineers were snooping around the southern edges of Egypt, measuring distances, plotting routes, and figuring out how to supply troops who might one day march into Kush. She realized her kingdom's ancient freedom was hanging by a single thread. Rome's encroachment didn't come quietly, either. They slapped heavy taxes on Nubian merchants trying to trade in Egyptian markets. Kushite envoys in Alexandria were treated like nuisances, forced to wait for days just to meet with low-level Roman officials. And worst of all, Rome began referring to Kush as nothing more than Egypt's southern frontier, as if the kingdom were some uncivilized backwater waiting to be cleaned up by Roman order. But Augustus made a huge mistake. He assumed that because Kush lay deep in Africa, far from the Mediterranean world he understood, It would fall apart the moment Roman standards appeared on the horizon. He thought that a nation ruled by a woman would fold like a flimsy hut in a hurricane. After all, Egypt had been taken easily enough. How hard could the land beyond possibly be? He was about to find out. In 25 BCE, Augustus ordered Aelius Gallus, the Roman prefect of Egypt, to lead an expedition into Arabia. Rome expected mountains of wealth from the venture, spices, incense, and luxury goods that were supposed to pour into Roman treasuries like rivers of gold. To make sure his campaign succeeded, Gallus was given permission to strip Egypt almost bare of its defenses, hauling 3 entire legions, about 15,000 of Rome's best soldiers, south across the Red Sea. And the moment those ships disappeared beyond the horizon, Amanirenas saw exactly the opportunity she'd been waiting for. The northern border of Kush was practically wide open now, guarded only by scattered auxiliary troops and Rome's arrogant belief that no African queen would ever dare to challenge them. Well, she was about to break that illusion with the full force of Kushite iron. But let me be clear, this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment raid, the kind of reckless stunt a desert warlord might pull. Amanirenas had been preparing for this for years. She'd studied Roman patterns, tested their weaknesses, paid attention to every misstep. When she finally moved, it was with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Throughout the summer of 25 BCE, messengers raced across the desert trails between Meroë and the northern provinces, carrying sealed orders written in the elegant Meroitic script. Weapons were pulled from armories that had been storing iron spearheads and bronze arrowheads for generations. Horses from the eastern highlands, lean, fast, and tough, were brought into the capital, each led by riders who were among the finest light cavalry in all of Africa. Then the real sign came. The great war drums of Kush began to thunder. Inside the royal temples, priests of Apidimak, the lion-headed god of war, performed ancient rites that hadn't been seen in a lifetime. Sacred lions, kept as living symbols of the war god, paced back and forth in their enclosures, while incense smoke curled into the heavy desert air. It felt like the entire kingdom was holding its breath, waiting for something enormous to unfold. By the time the Kushite army gathered on the plains north of Meroë, it was a sight to behold, 30,000 warriors standing ready. This wasn't some loose collection of tribal fighters. These were professional soldiers, men who had trained for this day since childhood. At the center stood the royal guard, elite warriors whose devotion to their Kandake went beyond loyalty. It was practically sacred. These were the men who had sworn solemn oaths before the lion god himself, vowing to fight to the death rather than retreat. On either side of them stood provincial regiments led by noble families whose lineages stretched back to the earliest warrior kings. From the eastern deserts came mounted archers, able to fire with deadly accuracy even while flying across the sands at full gallop. From the western highlands marched spearmen carrying long iron-tipped weapons strong enough to punch through the finest armor Rome ever produced. And pouring in from every corner of Kush were the bowmen, the legendary archers who'd earned the kingdom its title as the land of the bow. And at the head of all these thousands rode Amanirenas herself. She looked like something straight out of a legend, her armor gleaming in the sun, polished so bright it almost hurt to look at. Her war crown, crafted from pure Kushite gold and studded with gemstones mined far to the south, reflected the desert light like a blaze. Even her horse, a powerful, restless stallion bred in the royal stables, seemed to sense the importance of the moment, stamping the ground beneath her. Riding right beside her was her son, Prince Akinkadad, young, yes, but already toughened by the border skirmishes that were all too common in that part of the world. He carried a bow made from the best horn and sinew the kingdom could offer, and his quiver was packed with arrows fletched with eagle feathers. Together, the queen and her son were a living reminder of Kush's royal bloodline, a family that had never bowed to invaders and had no intention of starting now. As the massive army marched north along the Nile, following the old roads connecting Meroë to the rest of the world, news of their advance spread like wildfire. Farmers left their fields just to watch them pass, amazed by the endless ranks of soldiers. Kids climbed trees and palm trunks to catch a glimpse of their queen in her shining armor, while old men nodded quietly, remembering stories of earlier wars and recognizing that history was about to repeat itself. The Kushites didn't hide what they were doing. Their advance was meant to be loud and impossible to ignore, an open warning to Rome, and a rallying cry to everyone living between Egypt and Kush. Those borderlands had changed hands more times than anyone could count, and the people there knew their best chance at survival was to side with whoever looked strongest. And right then, it sure wasn't the Romans. When the first reports of the approaching army reached the little Roman outposts, panic lit through the ranks. The officers Gallus had left behind were suddenly responsible for defending Egypt with troops who were mostly auxiliaries, local men who weren't exactly eager to die for Rome when their own queen was marching toward them. Desperate messages were sent racing across the desert, begging Gallus to turn around and bring his legions back. But he was already far into the Arabian desert, chasing after the easy riches Augustus had promised him. By the time Amanirenas reached the first cataract, the old, traditional border between Egypt and Nubia, her army had grown even larger, swelling into a force that looked unstoppable. As we pushed farther north, more and more local leaders came forward to join our cause. These weren't just token supporters, they brought their own warriors with them, along with a lifetime of knowledge about the land we were marching through. Nubian merchants, fed up with the backbreaking Roman taxes they'd been forced to pay, jumped at the chance to help. They offered themselves as guides, suppliers, anything we needed. Even a few Egyptians, bitter over the loss of their independence and resentful of Rome's heavy-handed rule, started to look at Amanirenas as a possible liberator rather than a foreign invader. The queen's first move was chosen with deadly intention. She set her sights on the island fortress of Philae, a sacred place dedicated to Isis and a critical choke point for controlling the flow of the Nile. The Romans had turned it into one of their southern strongholds, practically daring anyone to challenge it. By taking Philae, Amanirenas wouldn't just clear the way for her army. She'd send a message straight to Rome. Nowhere was safe, not even their most secure outposts. The attack began before sunrise, while the air was still cool and a thin mist hovered over the Nile like a veil. Amanirenas had arranged her forces with the kind of precision that only comes from years of studying an enemy's rhythm. She knew this first strike had to be overwhelming. Rome relied on its reputation for being unbeatable. If she could crack that illusion in a single blow, everything afterward would fall more easily into place. In the faint gray light before dawn, the fortress looked unassailable, massive stone walls rising straight out of the river like they'd grown there. Roman guards strolled along the ramparts with torches in hand, completely unaware that death was already drifting toward them across the dark water. During the night, groups of Kushite warriors had crossed the Nile in reed boats so light they barely made a ripple. Their bodies were blackened with charcoal, their movements silent and deliberate, like they were part of the night itself. When the strike finally came, it hit with the sudden violence of a lightning bolt. The first Roman never even saw the arrow that pierced his throat. The second dropped before he had time to shout, a spear taking him out of the shadows. And by the time the Romans realized they were under attack, half of them were already dead, blood spreading across the temple stones, while Kushite war cries thundered in every direction. The surviving soldiers fought hard. They weren't cowards, but they had never faced anything like us. They were trained to repel scattered desert raids, not a fully coordinated attack from a professional army with centuries of military experience behind it. Kushite archers stationed on the mainland rained down arrows with such accuracy that Roman troops couldn't even cross their own courtyards without risking death. Meanwhile, assault teams scaled the walls using techniques honed over generations of border conflicts. Less than 2 hours after the first arrow flew, the banner of Kush was flapping proudly above Philae. The Romans who survived, those smart enough to surrender once the fight turned hopeless, were rounded up and brought before Amanirenas. Sitting tall on her warhorse, she looked them over with a steady gaze that didn't miss a thing. These were men who had served an empire that considered her people nothing more than a resource to exploit, bodies to enslave if necessary. And then she made a decision that people would talk about for centuries. Instead of having them executed the way Roman generals often did with defeated enemies, she ordered that they be treated with honor. Their wounds were cleaned and bandaged by Kushite healers, whose medical skills easily matched anything found in Roman camps. But make no mistake, her mercy carried a very sharp message. The Roman standards captured inside the fortress weren't destroyed. They were kept intact, displayed as trophies, proof that Rome's pride could be taken apart just like any other enemies. And then came the act that would soon echo across the Mediterranean world. The bronze statues of Augustus, the ones Rome had scattered across its new province as symbols of imperial authority, became targets of a ritual that struck at Rome's heart. One by one, Kushite warriors toppled them, understanding exactly what they were doing. It wasn't wild destruction. It was deliberate, controlled, symbolic. Augustus, the man who claimed to be the son of a god, found his likeness hacked into pieces by African axes. His bronze face, his carefully sculpted form, all of it reduced to shards scattered on the desert floor. But Amanirenas wasn't the kind of leader who stopped at breaking things. She had a deeper purpose behind every move she made. Instead of destroying the finest bronze statue of Augustus, the one sculpted by Rome's best artisans, she had it carefully packed up and transported all the way south to Meroë. This wasn't just a trophy. It was going to serve a far more meaningful role. When it finally reached the Kushite capital, the bronze head of Augustus was buried beneath the steps of a temple dedicated to victory. That meant every visitor who walked into that sacred space unknowingly stepped right on the image of Rome's proudest emperor. It was a gesture so bold, so full of contempt for Roman claims of divine authority, that Augustus would have probably choked with rage if he'd ever found out about it. And honestly, it captured exactly how Kush viewed Rome's inflated sense of itself. With Philae secured, Amanirenas' army pushed north without hesitation. They moved like hunters who'd tasted blood for the first time. One target after another fell in quick succession. Syene, the major trade city controlling commerce between Egypt and Nubia, opened its gates after a short siege that proved resistance was pointless. Elephantine, the fortress island that had guarded Egypt's southern border for centuries, surrendered once its garrison realized they weren't dealing with raiders, but with a conquering force that meant business. Everywhere we went, the same thing happened. Roman officials were captured, their paperwork and records seized for intelligence. Local communities, many of whom had suffered under Rome's punishing taxes, welcomed us as liberators. And all the wealth stored in those 3 fortified cities began flowing south toward Meroë, fueling more military operations and showing other African powers that resisting Rome wasn't just possible. It could be extremely profitable. The psychological shock of these victories spread through Egypt like ripples across still water. Roman administrators who had once strutted around confidently now found themselves looking over their shoulders. Auxiliary soldiers, often locals who had been treated poorly by Roman commanders, started wondering whether they were backing the wrong side. Most importantly, word of Kushite success traveled across Africa. From Libyan kingdoms to the tribes of the Western Desert, rulers who had been quietly considering surrender to Rome suddenly saw another option. If one African queen could knock Rome off balance, maybe, just maybe, the empire wasn't the unstoppable force it claimed to be. But Amanirenas was far too seasoned a commander to let victory cloud her judgment. Even while her warriors celebrated and counted their spoils, she was already thinking ahead. Documents taken from Roman archives showed the weak points in southern Egypt's defenses, but they also confirmed something she'd suspected all along. Aelius Gallus would eventually return with his 3 legions. And when he did, this war would enter a completely different phase. She understood her current advantage couldn't last forever. Speed, surprise, and the weakness of those scattered Roman garrisons had given her the upper hand. But Rome was a machine with endless manpower and mountains of resources. You couldn't outmuscle that forever. What she needed wasn't just a string of battlefield wins. She needed a political settlement, something that would guarantee Kushite independence long after she was gone. And to secure that, she would need Augustus to treat her not as a rebel to be crushed, but as a leader he had no choice but to negotiate with. That opportunity arrived sooner than any of us expected. News reached the Kushite encampment that Gallus had abandoned his Arabian campaign. His forces had been torn apart by disease, hunger, and the unforgiving desert, and now he was racing back north with whatever remained of his legions. The Roman prefect finally understood that his biggest threat wasn't Arabia. It was happening right in his own backyard. But Gallus still didn't truly understand the enemy he was dealing with. He assumed he was facing a tribal uprising, something he could squash with Roman discipline and a well-chosen defensive position. His strategy was simple. Gather his remaining troops at one strong point, force the Kushites to attack him head-on, and let Roman engineering and infantry do the rest. It was a plan that had worked on Celts, Germans, Gauls, pretty much everyone Rome had steamrolled so far. Against the Kandake of Kush, though, it was a recipe for disaster. The showdown came at Dakka, a fortified town guarding one of the rare, reliable crossings along this part of the Nile. Tactically, Gallus had chosen well. High ground gave his archers clean lines of fire, and his engineers had worked non-stop to build trenches and palisades designed to funnel attackers into deadly traps. From a purely Roman perspective, it was picture-perfect. But this wasn't Gaul. This wasn't Germania. And Amanirenas wasn't some chief leading a desperate last stand. And that brings us to the end of the tale. Amanirenas, the one-eyed queen who didn't flinch before the greatest empire the world had ever seen. She proved that courage doesn't care about borders, that defiance burns brightest when the odds are worst, and that sometimes, if your will is strong enough, the underdog can force even emperors to negotiate. Her legacy still echoes today, reminding us that real power isn't found in conquest or brute force. It's found in the unbreakable determination to stay free.